Right, ready? Ladies and gentlemen, if I could invite you please to take your seats. The event is ready to begin. There are a couple of people standing, so if there is a gap next to you, please can you move along to your right, so that way we can fit as many people sat down as possible. Thank you very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see all of you here. I hope you all enjoyed yourselves last night. Lots of fun conversations, a few bleary-eyed but attentive delegates. I'm Liam Halligan. I'm an economist. I didn't quite have the personality or enough personality to become an accountant, so I became an economist instead. And sitting next to me is a real economist, Shankar Singham, who is the chair of the Growth Commission, somebody I've known for many years. Shankar and I worked together in the Department of Trade on an advisory panel, believe it or not. Wonders never cease. And what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about growth, because everyone in this room understands that growth really is the key to it's the context in which all public policy is made. When the economy is growing, there's more money to go around. You can actually increase your tax revenues, even when tax rates come down. Who knew? And when there isn't growth, politics becomes a lot more combative, a lot nastier. There's a lot more fear. And the reality is, ladies and gentlemen, that pretty much since the global financial crisis, the Western world has never really got back to where it was. Cast your mind back to 1997. I was a young political reporter, and I remember at the time, as the Labour government came in, that year, 1997, Britain grew by almost 4%, and then it grew by between 2.5% and 3.5% for each of the next 5 years. No wonder they won again. And of course, the context now is very, very different. The UK isn't doing particularly badly by Western standards. Indeed, the OECD said just the other day that, having downgraded us many times over recent years, the Paris-based think tank said that we would grow this year second only to the US. But the US were on 2.6% and we're on 1.1%, equal with France and Canada. Look, we grew by 0.1% last year. We're barely going to make 1% this year. How do we fix this? How do we get growth? What levers do we pull? Well, luckily we've got Shankar here to discuss all that. Jacob Rees-Mogg will be with us very soon. He's just finishing up at another meeting, but of course this is a subject very close to his heart as well. Shankar, before we get into the real meat of this issue, it's great to see you. Tell us what the Growth Commission is. You seem to have been around for a couple of years now. I know lots of international economists work with you. I've been to several Growth Commission events. You produce, if I may say, very coherent publications. You've done 2 reports, major reports now, and I know you've got another one coming down the track later this month before Rachel Reeves' first budget. So tell us about the Growth Commission.
Yeah, thanks, Liam, and it's really good to be here with you. So we put the Growth Commission together. It's a group of I think we're about 13 now, international economists from, I think we have 6 from the US, 3 from the UK, 2 from Japan, 1 from India, 1 from Mexico. And we have a sort of principle, I suppose, that economic growth measured in terms of GDP per capita, so income per person, not GDP, which masks a range of other issues. That comes, and wealth is created, and I'm grateful that everyone is talking about wealth creation, including those who met in Liverpool earlier on this week. But what does wealth creation actually mean for us in the Growth Commission? Wealth creation happens when you have, when your economy is open, when trade is liberalized, when competition on the merits is the organizing economic principle, and when you protect property rights. And we also have a tax and fiscal model that looks at tax, growth promoting tax policies. Our reason for being is what you started the conversation with, which is the really poor GDP per capita growth in the G7. The US has been somewhat more resilient. It isn't a great benchmark, but it's been more resilient, certainly, than Western Europe and Japan. So what we want to do is get the G7 growing again, just to give you a sense of how bad the problem is and why we exist. Back in those heady days of 2.5%, 3.5%, 4% growth, back in around about 2000, the UK was probably 10% poorer than the US in terms of GDP per capita. The UK is now 75% poorer than the US GDP per capita, and in 2022, we became poorer than the poorest US state, which is Mississippi. So. And that's including the City of London and all the power of the City of London. So if you imagine taking out the City of London from this, you can imagine where we stand. We want to close the gap, and frankly, we want people to be asking questions, to put it in a nice and diplomatic way, why this is the case. Why are we? I mean, there are US states which are literally double the GDP per capita of the UK. That means the average British family, equivalent family in America, has double the income that we have. And in fact, it's not just that, because if you get this right in terms of competition and you lower costs, you're actually getting a double hit. You get more income and you get lower cost. The energy cost in the US is a third of what it is here. Other costs are much lower than here. So it's really much more than just double. It's 2 or 3 times the quality of life. There's no good reason why that has happened. It's entirely self-harm in our view, and therefore it can be fixed. And we come out with a set of policy proposals. We tell you, based on the models that we use, what the GDP per capita impact of those proposals would be. We can talk about that a bit later on in terms of the specifics. Yeah. But that's why we exist, and that's what we're hoping to do, is to get people to focus on this issue. And now that both political parties believe in wealth creation, we have the means to achieve that.
Let's go back to the global financial crisis, a defining moment, of course. Why is it, Shankar, in general terms, that, as I said, the Western world hasn't really got out of second gear since the global financial crisis? Why is it that growth now is so much slower than it was, even in the US?
Yeah. I think we learned all the wrong lessons from the global financial crisis. I mean, that's a whole topic that we could talk about. But, the reality is that what happened in the GFC was you had a significant amount of the opposite of the second pillar I talked about. So I talked about open trade, competition on the merits, and property rights protection. In terms of competition on the merits, you had an enormous amount of government distortion in the financial market. Yeah. You had government-owned enterprises, Fannie Mae and
it wasn't too much capitalism, it was too little.
It was too little competition, and they were government-owned enterprises. They were buying the debt. There were a whole series of regulations that required banks to hold non-conforming loans and bad debt on their books. In fact, if you were a Bank of America and you didn't provide certain types of loans, your license was imperiled. So there was a huge incentive to massively increase the size of the bad loans on books. There was a state-owned company that would never, full faith and credit of the United States government, would never go bankrupt. So that was buying these things. And then you had very clever people turning this rubbish, basically, into something that could be sold on. And it was inevitable that this was going to happen. So how do we respond to it? We responded to it by doubling down on the government distortions in the market, Sarbanes-Oxley, etc., increasing the regulatory burden. And so we didn't learn the lessons, I think, and we also had other factors, happening, which was the rise of the state-led sector in countries like China and other places, which we did nothing about. And so we lost a lot of productive manufacturing in the US and in the UK because of competition with state-owned enterprises in China, this steel, famously. And so you had a lot of factors going in that meant that we weren't dealing head on with the things that needed to be dealt with, and so we didn't grow. We also saw, partly as a result of all of this, massive increase in the size of the state, and more and more things done by the state, growth of the state, such that we now have GDP, debt as a percentage of GDP, knocking 100% in the US and the UK.
Debt interest payments of £90 billion a year.
And if you're not growing and you have that on the downside, you're going to drown in seas of red ink. It's just obvious. And that is what has happened to the G7. There is faster growth in other places. Andrew Griffith actually talked about the G20 being the comparator that we should all measure, and I agree with that. But our goal is to fix the problems in the G7. With the Growth Commission's goal is to fix the problems in the G7, and then we can hopefully start to grow like some of the faster growing economies in the world.
Again, before we get to the present day, what do you think, in retrospect, Shankar, of ultra-low interest rates, of massive expansion of central bank balance sheets? And then we did the same thing again during COVID, didn't we? We did more quantitative easing in the 18 months of the pandemic than we did in the whole of the previous 10 years. And the previous 10 years were historically unique when they happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem. I mean, there were many problems with the policy approaches to COVID, but one of them was the sort of massive turning on of government spending, and it made it quite difficult to argue against the sort of magic money tree if you're actually spending in that way. What was interesting actually about the COVID lockdowns is you compare US and UK policy. What we did in the UK is we gave money to businesses and we told them to back their employees.
Yeah.
So we gave a lot of money to businesses. And actually, as you would expect when you do that, business deaths during the lockdown period went down to zero. Business creations also went down to zero. The interesting thing in the US, but it was by no means a good policy, but money was given to households, not to businesses. So business deaths went up a lot in the lockdown period. It was quite a tough period. But business creations went up as well, and the businesses that were created in that period have remained.
Yeah.
And so what we've lost in the UK is that cohort of people who, get up into their, late 40s perhaps, and then they say, I've been doing something for 20 years. I want to go and set up my own business. I want to do my own thing. That group did not do what they would normally do.
Yeah.
And it became too easy for people to just take the money and not work. That's why we have a chronic problem of.
And the size of the state grew, and it hasn't retreated.
The size of the state rarely retreats.
Yeah.
So it is very tough. In fact, I would say that it's almost impossible to rein in the size of the state.
You just got to outgrow it.
You've got
right?
to outgrow it,
Yeah.
exactly. You've got to grow the private sector so it's able to function.
So somebody called Keith Joseph once said, I remember quoting this in my A-level economics, which ages me. He was talking about the private sector versus the public sector, and he famously said of Britain in the mid-70s, the rider is heavier than the horse. Just talk to us, great quote,
Yes, yeah.
just talk to us about the dangers of the state getting to the size it is. Again, before we move on to how we try and outgrow the size of the state. I've mentioned debt interest, which is higher than the amount of money we spend on schools. So think of the morality of that. Absolutely astonishing. But what are the other dangers that you see of the state getting as big as it is, and probably a lot bigger in the next couple of years?
Yeah, so I mean they're related.
Yeah.
The horse and rider is a good analogy, because what tends to happen, and we can start to see this now with some of the policies that people have talked about, and this isn't just things that the new government is planning to do. These are also things that the previous government was moving forward on. So, for example, Great British Energy, the nationalisation of the rail, I mean, the Great British Nuclear, these are not things that are total inventions of the Labour government. These are things that were, in the works beforehand. And the problem is that if you have a state enterprise that is basically delivering a service in the market that could be delivered by a private firm, it will crowd out the private competitors. And so what you will tend to have, and this is I think what we will have with rail, energy, nuclear, and other arterial sectors of the economy, which are incredibly important, is you'll have a state-owned enterprise with government contracts to private players, because the big private players, the big incumbents, want their balance sheet risk transferred to the government.
Yeah.
So that's what they will do. They'd like to have a monopoly with balance sheet risk transferred to the government. That's what we'd all like to have, frankly. But why is that bad? Because, one of a famous quote from a Supreme Court judge referred to monopoly. The best monopoly profit was a quiet life, because you don't have to compete. And if you create that kind of set of incumbents, then they're not that you haven't liberalised the forces of competition. You're not going to generate wealth. It's just a government contract, basically. And in
ultimately
fact,
going to be inefficient, bad taxpayer
and,
value.
and well, competition is what causes
PFI on speed, right?
Competition is what causes good service. It causes price to go down. All of these things. All of those things there will not be an incentive for those things. And what's interesting is that in energy and in rail, the CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority, already ruled in 2015 that the way to deal with electricity, Jacob, the way to deal with electricity was to liberalise competition, to deal with grid connection problems, to deal with the anti-competitive government regulation in the electricity sector, and laid out a path to do that related to what Ofgem should be doing. This has been completely ignored. On rail, the CMA also said that on-rail competition, in other words, there's no point having multiple rail companies in regions because they do not compete with each other. You do not choose to go to Cornwall because your train to London became more expensive. So therefore, on-rail competition, the kind of thing that happens in airlines and airports, is a much better way of liberalising competition. And there is no reason you can't do this. But again, this was ignored. And so the solution tends to be, and this is a sort of fundamental problem, I think, is the view tends to be, if something needs to be done, the government needs to do it. Whereas actually, when the government does it, it crowds out the private sector, all these negative effects occur, and we can now measure them in terms of the GDP per capita impact, and I'm sure we'll get on to this.
We will. Jacob, lovely to see you. Thank you to Jacob for rushing from his previous meeting to be here. We're very, very glad you're here. Of course, Jacob is a former business secretary. We started, Jacob, by talking about what happened after the global financial crisis, how we haven't really got growth going again properly, certainly in the Western world since the global financial crisis. And as you came in, we were discussing that wonderful Keith Joseph quote about the rider being heavier than the horse, which you will remember. And I asked Shankar just then, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this too, if I may. What are the dangers when the state gets as big as it currently is and is set to get even bigger?
Well, I haven't yet finished reading, but I'm a good way through John Moynihan's excellent book, which I would strongly recommend.
It's an excellent book.
Because you get to the point that there's nobody left to tax, effectively. So where do you get the money from? You're taxing people that the state is paying, but that's just circulating money within a closed system. It's not in any sense new money. So if you get to 40, 50% of GDP being public expenditure, the burden is falling on an increasingly small number of people in the private sector who pay for things. So the crucial thing to remember, only the private sector pays for anything. Yes, civil servants pay tax, but it's not real. They're giving money back to the same people who gave it to them. And we get more and more people on welfare who are dependent on the state, fewer people earning, and eventually the economy will collapse. That we cannot continue with growth at 1%. When the OECD said we're going to have 1% growth, we were all thrilled. It was meant to be really good news. And our deficit is, about 5%. If you carry on like that, you go bust. There is no way out of it. And so we've got to get the state under control and reduce it. Otherwise, the rider is getting heavier than the horse. It almost is.
How did this happen under the Tories, Jacob? How did the state get so big? We've talked a bit about, despite your efforts, by the way, despite your efforts, we've talked a little bit about lockdown. We've talked about how the state advances, but is much harder to put into reverse. You basically have to outgrow the state to bring it to a decent, manageable level. But a lot of this happened under the Tories. How?
How did it happen under the Tories? Well, COVID is obviously important. A huge amount is spent. And I think rightly, actually, I think that if you're telling businesses they've got to close down, you have to compensate them for doing so. Now, in retrospect, people are beginning to think that lockdowns were wrong, and I thought at the time they were going on too long.
You did.
I accepted the first lockdown, but after that I thought we should have been opening up. I must take my share of responsibility because I was in favour of helping people with their energy bills when I was Energy Secretary. Mainly because I thought it would have bankrupted the nation, that the ninefold increase was simply something that individuals couldn't bear, and I do think the state is there to help you in extremis. But you're right, it's very hard to take things away once you've given them, and we made a number of crucial mistakes during and after COVID. So no controls were brought back in terms of people claiming disability benefits and welfare benefits, so you got a huge increase in fraud, or people just stretching things a little to make sure that they qualified, and that's been a very big cost. We have refused to shrink the civil service, it continues to grow, or to get them to work. I mean, this is really important, and this created, it was very bad for us in the election, it created the feeling of broken Britain, because when people rang HMRC, they spoke to somebody at home, if they ever got through, who was just about to go out and do the weekly shop and didn't really want to help them with their complex tax problem. So that's been very damaging to productivity. Productivity in the NHS has actually been falling in spite of all the extra money that it's been getting, because we decided that we would outsource it to NHS England and abandon political control, which was a stupid thing to do because we got all the blame, and NHS England ran it as another bureaucracy, an unaccountable quango. So we didn't take control of the levers of power, and then we found that we couldn't get things done. And as you rightly say, reversing things is much harder, as you see with winter fuel payments. I think Labour's made a mistake with winter fuel payments, not in getting rid of them. I don't think the state should pay out universal benefits to all and sundry. But it is a terrible mistake to take it away from people who are already getting them. Why? Because it's unfair. I even thought this on agricultural subsidies. If you've set up your whole business on getting a subsidy, you can't be told overnight that you're losing it. That's a cheat by the state. Likewise, of the 10 million people getting the winter fuel allowance, there will be many, many, many of them for whom £300 is actually the difference between their accounts balancing at the end of the year and not. So what I would have done with benefits like that is grandfather them. And I think that is the way to cut things, is not by taking them away from people who already have them, but take them away from people who have never yet got them. And I'd like to see that done with public sector pensions, to move away from defined benefit to defined contribution. It would have a high initial cost, because you take it yearly rather than deferring it, but it would be the most important long-term, multi-decade saving.
And public sector pension deficits, the liability, which is literally a pay-as-you-go system, isn't it? They're not funded pensions. We're the asset management capital of the world, and we can't even set up our own funded public sector pension scheme. A few local authorities.
I managed money for local authority pension funds in the past. But bear in mind that those deficits are very sensitive to changes in interest rates. So when the Bank of England managed to get into an awful muddle at the time of Kwasi Kwarteng's famous budget, its pension fund lost £1 billion, but its percentage funding went up. Now, how did that happen? Well, because the increase in interest rates meant that the discount rate you were applying to the liabilities reduced the level of the liabilities by more than the loss that they'd made on the LDIs. So
Amazing.
we've got to be quite careful about the pension fund accounting because there's a lot of sort of funny money in it.
Before I come back to Shankar, and before we get into the real specifics of policies that you both believe will engender the growth that we need, I just want to ask you, Jacob, I'm sure it crossed a few people's minds when you said it. You're known as a very polite man, if I may say so. You're a very good writer. Tell us about that letter you sent to civil servants asking them to turn up. I mean, as you were writing it, were you smirking? Were you laughing? Were you frightened?
No.
You want to know, right?
All right. The letter was based on, which you will all be familiar with because you'll have delivered many of them, a sorry you were out card when you're canvassing. And it was in exactly that format. It was sorry you were out when I called. I look forward to seeing you when I next come back. I confess there was an element of sarcasm in this because I'd heard that there was a whole department of the civil service with hundreds of square feet of office space in Whitehall where there was nobody, not one solitary soul. And this was under the Cabinet Office, and I was a Cabinet Office minister. And so we went round, we got in the Treasury building. The Cabinet Office, this slight aside, always has the most wonderful and politest security men. They are so good. The Treasury has the rudest and most difficult. Even as a minister, it was always difficult to get into the Treasury, even when I had an office in there. I mean, it was... Anyway, but we got in, and we went up, and I left 3 of these notes, which then the unions were so furious they got everywhere. Every newspaper reported it. It had much more effect than the 3 notes if they'd just ignored it. But I did another one of these.
Wow, scoop.
Which was even more fun in its way, that my predecessor, Lord Agnew, was not willing to renew the lease on the very plush offices that the Serious Fraud Office has overlooking Trafalgar Square. And he had said, no, you must look for other space and cheaper space and so on and so forth. So then they come to me, I've taken over a few weeks before, on the 24th of March, to say if I don't approve their lease, they will have nowhere to live the next day, which I thought was slightly bad form. So I'm in a meeting, I've got some people in my office and some are on Zoom, and I say, right, let's go to their office and see if it's being used. So we went out of Whitehall, walked up to Trafalgar Square, my office ringing to warn them that I was coming. They kept on saying, don't come, it's not convenient, they can have a meeting with the director next week, etc., etc. I said, no, I'm going to have a look. So I got there. Amazingly, everybody was free to see me when I got there. So all these urgent things disappeared, except I should think about 10% of the desks were being used of this fine London office space that they said was essential to run their trials, which are important. But if they're so essential, why weren't they actually there? Now, it was too late for me to refuse to renew the lease. What could I do? I couldn't make... It was quite tempting to make the Serious Fraud Office homeless the next day, but I really couldn't do that. So I did renew it, and my plan was that as part of levelling up and moving people out to the regions, I would get them to go to Wrexham. Unfortunately, I wasn't in office long enough to make this happen.
Brilliant diversion into what will become political folklore. Fantastic. Very interesting. And I think a lot of the country cheered when you wrote that letter, silently cheered.
Well, I love the fact that on the day Jonathan Reynolds says, all I was doing was potty, the boss of Amazon says, get back to the office. Now, who do you believe? Somebody who runs a multi-billion-dollar, hugely profitable business, or a bureaucrat?
Well said. Shankar, let's get back to the specifics of growth. The Growth Commission does a lot of very detailed modelling, and you've identified some policies that you think are particularly potent in terms of expanding the economy. Which one sticks out more than all the others?
Yeah, so we've done now 2 growth budgets for the UK. One in around about the November event last year, one in March of this year, and we'd encourage you to look at them and read them, because they do set out exactly what we think the UK government should do. We will be doing another one on October the 22nd, just before the budget. It hasn't really changed in terms of what our policy prescriptions are. Essentially, they won't be hugely surprising to people. I mean, we basically said, look, a tax policy where you're progressively moving to lower corporate income tax is important. We have recommended that in the regulatory space, a series of things that you would do. So the model that we use, that you referred to, is a model that it's an econometric model, 118 countries, 10-year panel data, and it correlates very closely GDP per capita movements with movements in those three pillars I mentioned: trade, competition, and property rights. So we can measure these things now. And what we find is that labour market flexibility is a big mover of GDP per capita increases. So don't make the UK labour market less flexible than it is the first thing I would say. Planning reform. So we basically said in our growth budget, do the following things and you will get about 26 to 27% GDP per capita increase over the next 20 years. So in other words, a significant, over 1% improvement over and above projection. And just to give you a sense of how massive that is, and Jacob referred to this earlier on, and you referred to this, Liam, earlier on in terms of the effect of stalled growth. If the US's economy had grown 1% less year on year from 1890 to 1980, in 1980 it would be smaller than the economy of Mexico. This is an indication of compounding. And people say, oh, well, that's a long period of time. Well, we've had 25 years of stalled growth in the G7. So we're in this territory now. We are in this territory where it really makes a difference, which is why you've gone from 10% poorer than the US to 75% poorer than the US. So of that 26, 27% GDP per capita gain that is available, about a third of it is planning. That is a fact. So moving the needle on planning. It's
not just residential
reform.
property.
No, this is
infrastructure.
all planning, infrastructure,
Nuclear
roads,
power stations,
nuclear power
reservoirs.
the whole thing
Yeah.
is about 7%. So, and so we've made recommendations about, now you need to tackle planning seriously. It needs to be zonal. We believe in zonal planning systems. We believe that you've got to tackle the role of statutory consultees. These are the entities that come in at the very end of the planning process and find a bee that has to be protected, and then the clock runs again. You've got to look at judicial review. You have to look at that's a tremendous chilling effect on the planning process. So there's a whole set of things around planning, and then. On within the labour market, now the previous government was not intending to make the labour market less flexible, but they were intending to increase the minimum wage to levels that were higher than other OECD countries, 2/3 of median income.
It's already very high internationally, isn't it?
Yeah.
Minimum wage.
So I have no problem with a minimum wage. It all depends on what it's set at.
Yeah.
So. We think freezing it to where it is now is probably the best thing you can do. Certainly don't massively increase it, because that labour market flexibility is about 20% of that competition pillar by itself. It's a big mover of that pillar.
So you think it would be a disincentive to employ people
if it goes much higher than it is now? Yes, it clearly would, in my view. So you've got labour market issues. Then energy is the next big thing. So lowering the staggering energy cost in the UK, which is 3 times what it is in the US. It's very difficult to be a competitive business if your energy cost of production is so high. Now, we are also modelling the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which I know Jacob is interested in. So October 8th and 9th, we're releasing that report. The adoption of the carbon border adjustment mechanism will cost UK people per person around 700 or so pounds, we think, roughly, that kind of order of magnitude. And there are other things you can do. to deal with the issue of carbon leakage. So certainly following the EU's CBAM would, I think, be a big drain on the economy and make it very difficult to get that released. But dealing with the competition barriers in the energy sector, of which there are many, dealing with interconnection policy, all of those things, we think is very.
What's the
important.
average time to get hooked up to the national grid in our advanced dynamic society?
Well, it's months now. If you're lucky, maybe a year.
I thought the average was about 7 or 8 years.
And what this does is it turns the asset, which is the grid connection, which should not be particularly valuable, into something of huge value.
I'm going to buy your site for 100 million quid because you're already connected to the grid.
It's distorting all of, and this is happening, so it's distorting all of the sort of economic decision making that people are making. And then on rail and the other arterial sectors of the economy, more competition is better. Don't nationalise things. Don't create a government-owned enterprise that will compete against the private sector. Those sorts of basic things that you wouldn't do. And then the retail banking system in the UK is a big problem, and there's a sclerotic, oligopolistic banking sector that we have. The fact that we didn't finish the sale of the government share in NatWest is a real problem. It means that if you compare other countries that responded to the GFC, I mean, I did the TOP program when I was in a law firm in Washington. We actually did the process of buying banks. Every week we had associates who would buy whole slews of US banks and sell them the next day and so on, and that's $1 trillion worth of effort to get all of this done. But all of that was done in a matter of years, a couple of years. It was done, finished. The government has had a stake in a major retail bank in the UK now for 14 years, more than 14 years. And that is very, very destructive to competition. And there is a reason why challenger banks in the UK don't seem to succeed. When I used to do a lot of antitrust competition work, and when you see new entrants failing, when there appears to be a lucrative market to be had, you know that there is a problem. Something is happening. And basically we don't have enough competition in that sector. And this creates a lack of financial products for people. I mean, when there was such a huge reaction to interest rates going up, it is interesting that in Australia and the US, which also had interest rates going up because of COVID lockdowns and policies, there was not such a reaction. Why was there not such a reaction? Because of the number of mortgage products that were available to people, because of the ferocious competition in the banking sector. You could have an ARM, you could have a fixed mortgage, you could have a floating for 5 years, for 2 years, every imaginable thing you could have. And so the number of people affected by an increase in the interest rate was much less. So competition in retail banking is also a critical sort of piece of this.
And internationally, other banks tend to pass the interest rate rises on to savers more than our banks do. It's always insane to me that interest rate cuts are immediately reflected in savings rates, but interest rate rises
are not.
Often aren't.
Yes.
I mean,
but again,
mad.
it comes down to competition. I think there was a session I was at here about the Australian superannuation funds and the pension funds, and the absolutely robust competition for your pension that they have. And they have league tables of this. We don't have this in the UK, and that it is very important to sort of get that level of competition into that market as well. And so if you do all of those things, that's where our 27-28% number comes from.
Jacob, I want to ask you, if I may, about planning. What you think of Labour's plans, if you think they will deliver growth. So let's get your response to that first.
I hope they do, but I'm not necessarily that optimistic, because I think Labour believes that it can be done by central control. And that won't work. And for some reason they seem to have excluded London, which seems just to be a Bang to Sadiq Khan, which is very odd. They also seem to think that you can force landowners to sell, which is going to be extremely difficult
I agree.
to do. even a government that has no respect for private property finds it very, very difficult for people to give up little bits of land. And when you're trying to do something, land is in lots and lots of different bits of ownership, and there are court cases and delays. So I think trying to stop landowners profiting won't work. You just need a much more flexible system. And unless they're willing to tackle the nutrients directive, and they're willing to look at the laws on badgers and on bats and on all of this, you're going to find that exactly the same things that stopped us stopped them. I was talking at the Telegraph thing. When I was Energy Secretary, I wanted to approve a power station that was going to make power from waste, and the waste is currently shipped to Denmark. And I wasn't allowed to do it because the applicant hadn't made proper provision for the common seal. Now, the common seal is common. There are quite a lot of them, and all they were worried.
Clues in the name.
All they were worried about was that the common seal was stupid and would swim into a boat that was bringing waste to be incinerated. I thought the common seal was probably quite intelligent and would know not to swim into a boat. Anyway, I couldn't do it. And they've got so much to get rid of that they believe in. That's the problem. We don't believe in it, or at least some of us don't. But the Labour Party is all in favour of this environmentalist approach, and it will want to build green buildings which are much more expensive and have net zero cement and all of this. Everything puts cost then at perhaps a different stage in the process, but nonetheless is part of the process. I agree with Shankar, we need to look at some zoning system. You need much more permitted development right. You need to allow people to get on with things on their land.
And just for the record, Jacob, I don't agree with Labour's policies either. They often claim that I do because of my book Home Truths, but what they are trying to do, particularly on the use of CPO on landowners, as you and I have discussed over many years, that planning uplift is utilised in many countries, and I personally think and have advocated that the planning uplift should be shared. Labour want to take the whole of the planning uplift to the state, which will result in endless court cases, even use of the ECHR. I personally think Labour's planning rules will be scuppered by the very ECHR that Keir Starmer says he would die before taking Britain out of. I want to ask you also, Jacob, and then I'll come back to Shankar, and then we'll get some questions. Do you believe in life after life? No. Do you believe in green jobs? At least, do you believe in green jobs that can quickly replace, the 30,000 good people who work in the North Sea, often supporting families and communities with those jobs? The million people who work in our car industry? Because Gary Smith doesn't believe in these immediate green jobs, and he runs the third biggest union in the country. And nor does Sharon Graham, and she runs the second biggest union in this country. You've now got a real rift, haven't you? Even at the beginning of their victory march between Labour and the unions on net zero.
This may be the first time and the last time I ever say this at a Conservative Party conference, but Gary Smith is absolutely right. We passed an energy bill that's going to allow carbon dioxide to be stored in some of the places that gas came out of. So geologically the structures are great and so on and so forth. And that, yes, may create some jobs. Who will pay for those jobs? Government subsidy, taxpayer subsidy. The only time you're creating real jobs is when they're created by the free market doing something that the free market would do of its own volition. Jobs created by public subsidy are just a different form of unemployment, aren't they? You are paying people to do things that the market doesn't think is worthwhile.
The state can sometimes catalyse private sector.
Can it?
Can it? I don't know.
Well, when? I mean, I think, yes, perhaps by building roads.
Yeah.
I mean, the economic benefit of roads is well known, though in the 18th century the private sector managed to do that, and the wonderful Birmingham Relief Road, which is fantastic. It's a private sector initiative. So the state can do some things, but very often...
You feel like you're in Singapore just for a few moments.
Yeah, absolutely, and the road is clear, and you hope there isn't a speed... Oh, sorry, I was going down the road. And there are no lorries because they don't like to pay it.
Yeah.
So I think real jobs are created by the private sector, green jobs are created by the state, that the economy booms when you have cheap energy. That's been true for hundreds of years. You can't just change that overnight. The 2,000 jobs that were lost to Paul Talbot yesterday are jobs sacrificed on the altar of the green ideology. It is absolutely crazy. They pay much higher energy prices, as Shankar was saying, than anybody else. We will now import steel from China, which will have even more emissions if you care about emissions, because it will have come by sea, and therefore there will be all the transport emissions. The green jobs, the green economy is all nonsense. We are not going to be, and I hate to disagree with the great Boris Johnson, the Saudi Arabia of wind. We could, we could have become very successful on fracking. I would still advocate fracking. Cheap gas powers the economy, and I would like to see cheap gas.
When you crunch the numbers, is net zero a contributor to or a drain on economic growth in the foreseeable?
So when we looked at energy and increasing competition in the energy sector, energy generation is fundamental.
Yeah.
We are going in a negative direction in terms of energy generation. I think other things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism are also damaging to GDP per capita growth. Not to say I'm not making any statement about carbon emissions, even carbon leakage. I'm just saying that the CBAM is massively destructive to GDP per capita gains. It will impose wealth destruction on the UK economy. If we follow the EU model, all of the everything covered by the European emission trading scheme has to be part of the CBAM. Ultimately, it's 6 products to start with, but ultimately it will be everything, and that will be even more damaging to the economy. I think, can the government catalyse the creation of jobs? I think where you look at a subsidy, it can work the closer you are to deep research. So, for example, deep space exploration, government subsidy in that area is fine, in my view. Suborbital space exploration, well, there's a market developing in that. So, again, you've got an issue of the government crowding out the private sector. I mean, there is a suggestion actually now that SpaceX may actually be investing more than NASA. So there is on suborbital in that space, not on deep space. So the closer you are to pure research, the more a subsidy or a government spend or a government investment is acceptable. The more you get towards commercial application, the more you need to get it out of your system, because it is fundamentally wealth destructive for reasons that were discussed.
And yet a lot of our energy sector, they're subsidy junkies. We have a high share of renewables in our electricity generation. Some days it's 30, 40, 50%. Some days, of course, it's zero. And yet even though we have, or maybe because we have a high share of renewables in our electricity mix, our firms, our households are often paying the highest electricity bills in Europe.
Yes, they, without doubt they are. And then if you look at what we're trying to do with the policy, with the climate policy, is to get the countries like India and China and so forth to remove fossil fuels from their grids, because that's how it works. That's how the border adjustment works. Is you take into account the energy that's produced from the grid. So if I make Indian steel and I sell it in the UK or I sell it in Europe, there will be an accounting of the energy that came from the grid to make that steel, which is obviously all coal, mostly coal and oil. The Indian energy price is 3 cents per kilowatt hour.
Yeah.
Ours is about 48.
Yeah.
So the idea that 1.1, 1.3, however many it is now, billion Indians are going to be quite happy with a move of 3 cents to 40 cents per kilowatt hour is absurd. So they're not going to do it. And there's another very fundamental problem about this, which is we are driving, and this is not an economic issue, this is a geopolitical issue, we are driving developing countries into the arms of the BRICS. We are creating a net between the G7 and developing countries. And those markets, though they are growing fast, they cannot sustain the production that is needed to lift billions of people out of poverty. Traditionally, the way that is done is by accessing the markets of the US and Europe and the UK and the G7. You can't do that anymore. You're reliant on China, Russia, Brazil, etc. It's not going to be enough, and there are going to be significant tensions and strains. You're going to have resource constraints. You're going to have small conflicts all over the world as a result of this policy. So it isn't just an economic disaster. It's also
But this is
geopolitical.
what nice people believe in.
Well, there aren't enough of those people in the developing world, unfortunately. So, there's lots of reasons why it's bad. I wanted to say one thing about the. I would say that was quite negative. Apologies, but I want to say one thing positive, which is there is a sense in the UK and in Europe and in the US increasingly that we kind of exhausted all the potential gains of pro-competitive regulatory reform. I've heard commentators say governments tell people that you can do regulatory reform and get all of these gains, and that's why we need to have an expansive trade policy, and that's a lie. The gains are already exhausted. In our model, when we look at the UK, and if you recall, it's an econometric model, so each country has a score, a pillar score in those three pillars: trade, competition, and property rights. If I improve the UK's pillar score by 1 point, so let's say the UK's pillar score in competition is 4.6. This is an assessment of the competition in its regulatory system. If I improve that by 1 point, 15% increase, I get a 13% GDP per capita gain. That's a state to state. That's not going to happen overnight. That's a state to state, how long it takes you to get that 1 point gain, which is significant. It might be 10 years. But it's still about 1% per year.
So in other words, we're far from a stripped-down Hayek economy. There's
we
lots of
are
growth-thwarting regulation that we can
There's
remove
adapt. There's three kinds of problems with regulation in terms of cost. Two that people focus on and one that they don't. The two are compliance cost, the business cost, the red tape cost, if you like. And people do talk about that. But there is something there, but it's not massive. Then there is the cost of divergence, and this is very much discussed in the context of the UK-EU relationship. That if we diverge in our regulations from Europe, that's a business cost. And there is a cost to diverging from other countries. Harmonized regulation across the world, there wouldn't be any divergence cost. But the third element of cost is the anti-competitive harm that you inflict on the market, and that's that 13%. That's the big gain, and that's what no one focuses on. What we need to do is we need to move into a world of regulatory competition where we're competing to find the best and most pro-competitive regulatory framework around in the world, and we're interoperating on the basis of equivalence, mutual recognition. Jeremy Hunt yesterday talked about something that's the best kept secret, which is we agreed to unilaterally recognize in medicines approvals in the US, EU, Japan, and the UK's Medicines Agency. So if I want to market a medicine and I have a US approval or even a Japanese approval, I can do it in the UK now. That is a massive game changer. If we could do that in lots of areas and do equivalence on the reverse side, that would be a huge gain. And that is in fact the battle for the world's operating system that's going on right now. It is not between the US and Europe and China and so on. It is between that way of approaching problems and a regulatory harmonization and export of my own regulation in order for you to have access to my market. And I'll just close with one thing, just to show you that we're losing this battle. I did say I'd be positive. I can't
You were
be
for a bit.
entirely
It's
positive.
okay.
But in the US, Missouri grain farmers have been told by ADM, selling to Missouri silos for onward sale to the US market, that they have to satisfy European deforestation regulation, which isn't even the law in Europe yet.
That's
Consultants are telling AI companies you must satisfy European AI Act, because what are businesses doing? businesses are not profiles in courage. You know, that they will do the least that they can do. And if you can satisfy the most restrictive regulatory environment, this is the Brussels effect, you know, you can impose that on the rest of the world. And remember that 13%. That is a world where you lose that.
Yeah.
And arguably quite a lot more.
Yeah.
So that is the big battle that's going on, and we clearly advocate regulatory competition and improving competition in regulation. And if you do these things, there are significant gains that can be achieved.
We got time for one last question, which goes to Jacob. Jacob, what are you going to do with yourself now?
What am I going to do with myself?
Yeah.
I'm
A lot of people in the room and the country are interested.
That's very flattering.
Of course
I'm
they are.
not sure they are.
No, they are.
GB News, 8 to 9 o'clock, every evening, Monday to Thursday. I have a fantastic film crew following me around for Discovery Plus, which you'll be able to watch in November and find out what life is like with the Rees-Moggs. I'll be fascinated to discover this
Are you
myself.
going to be sort of upmarket Kardashians or something?
That's not particularly what I had in mind.
Imagine the viewing figures.
Well, the mind boggles, but that's in the hands of these distinguished people here. We will see what comes of it. And I've also just joined Substack,
Wow.
which is fascinating because it's disintermediation. I mean, Shanker could give you a much more interesting economic analysis of what Substack does, but in brief, you write about what you want rather than what somebody's commissioned you for. The people who read it have decided that they want to read you rather than what newspaper editors think is good for them. And what my wife would like me to call an added bonus in one of the ugliest tautologies of which she greatly disapproves, but the added bonus is you get paid for it. So it's quite fun to say. I did one this morning on whether or not I lied to the Queen on prorogation as the opener for my constitutional series.
Well, why don't you do your next one on the note that you left to civil servants?
That's a good idea.
And the other story that you told us, because
Yeah.
it deserves an audience bigger and better even than the audience
Is
we
there
have.
a better audience
There
than
isn't,
this?
of course there isn't.
No, of course not.
Give yourself a round of applause. Thank you so much to the Growth Commission for hosting this, for inviting me. Thank you to Shanker Singham, who's the chairman of the Growth Commission, and indeed Jacob Rees-Mogg. And thanks to all of you for coming. I'm Liam Halligan.